Welcome, class. So thanks for coming to this Friday morning lecture where we're going to be learning about HTML and CSS. This is just going to be kind of a basic introduction. Hopefully this is going to be a review for you all from the pre-work, but I don't know, it's probably not going to be a review for some of you, so we're going to talk about it together. Anyways, so let's just start basic, define some terms here. Can anyone tell me what is HTML? Someone's got to know this.
It stands for hypertext markup language. It's kind of like a structure.
Okay.
For web pages.
Thank you. Alicia, I think you also have the correct answer, so you both get bonus points. But yeah, so HTML is hypertext markup language. So what the heck is a hypertext?
That is a good question.
The text that also encodes like properties and things to do.
Yeah, more specifically, I would say it's text that links to some other text or to another document. All right, so markup, that's kind of just like a format or a language that we can use for describing like visual text. There's got to be a better definition for that. What the heck is markup? Okay, this is definitely not a technical definition. I should have expected that. I'm sorry. But so a markup is saying that this isn't a programming language exactly. With HTML, we cannot do like loops or have variables or whatever. So this isn't a programming language, but it is a language. But the language that we're going to be using doesn't describe logic to be performed. It just describes how text can be structured on a screen. So that's markup.
And some of you might have seen and be familiar, like when you look at the README documents and like the lessons and GitHub, if you look at the source for those files, it's written in a, is that a markup language, Raphael? They call it Markdown, but it's like some very simple rules for formatting text.
Yeah, I would say that Markdown is a markup language. I don't know why they're so confusing about the spatial directions with it though.
Yeah, just to make, because programming isn't confusing enough.
Yeah, programmers always have funny ways of giving things terrible names. I've got some fun stories about that, but that's a tangent. We can come back to it later. So yeah, markup language, it's not a programming language. It just kind of describes the structure of your content. So a lot of people don't really take HTML seriously because it's not a programming language. And while that's true, it's not a programming language, and it's certainly much easier to work with than, you know, Python or JavaScript. It's also true that there is some stuff you need to know. It's more like knowledge-based. You just have to kind of memorize all of these different facts and features of HTML. But if you don't know how HTML works, you're going to have a tough time building an elegant front end. So like, don't disregard this. Don't say like, it's not a programming language, I don't have to care about it. Like, take it seriously to the extent that there is some complexity in HTML. Okay, so can anyone just define for me real quick, what is CSS?
It's like a style that you style how you output your HTML.
So yeah, it's cascading style sheets, it's plural. So these define the style of your web page, kind of the look and feel, the presentation, the aesthetics. So it doesn't define the content. It doesn't define any logic. It just makes your website look attractive, basically. So like CSS is the difference between Hacker News and Medium, basically. Like, so we've all been to Medium, these like really pretty looking blogs where everything is like styled super nicely and whatever. I don't really like Medium articles so much. I read Hacker News a lot of really great articles here. And even though this is the same kind of like news site with articles, there's basically no CSS on Hacker News. Like this is mostly just HTML defining the format of everything. Styling is very simple, just kind of a list of links. I love it. I mean, there is some CSS on Hacker News, but much less than on your typical website. So the critical bit here is that these cascading style sheets cascade, which means that we're not going to have just one style sheet that applies styles to our website, but we might have multiple style sheets applying multiple styles to the same elements. And so we have to understand what happens when there are multiple similar styles applied simultaneously. That's the cascade. All right, so that's some basic terminology. We know kind of what these acronyms stand for, at least. Let's try to write a little code here. So again, hoping this is review for many of us. If I'm making my index.html document here, what is the very first HTML element that I need?
Index. Doc type.
Your HTML, right?
So
depends on the standard.
it does depend on the standard. Technically, you're supposed to have a doc type for your HTML document. Does that look like again? I don't actually write these usually. Yeah, okay. So in theory, you're supposed to have the doc type at the top of your document that tells the browser what version of HTML you're using. For the past, I want to say like 10 years or so, this has been like what your doc type is supposed to look like. This basically just means use like modern HTML5. So it used to actually say like, you know, HTML, like, I don't know, 4.2 or whatever. There were specific doc types for different versions of HTML, but now you just say doc type HTML and be like, this is modern HTML5. And honestly, you can omit this doc type and most browsers will correctly assume that you're using modern HTML unless you specify otherwise. So honestly, I don't usually put it in there, even though it's like technically part of the page, technically supposed to be there. So we're gonna not worry about that too much. Also, the doc type is technically not an HTML element. It's just kind of this other, like a comment basically that tells your browser what version of HTML you're using. Maya?
Yeah, sort of related. I've seen on like different resumes, people put HTML or HTML5, but you're saying it's automatically going to go to HTML5. So do we need to put both on a resume or like what is typical?
I would just say that you know HTML, honestly. Like HTML5 is the latest version of HTML, but it's also like kind of a basic skill that I wouldn't want to split hairs with it too much. You know, like I wouldn't spend a paragraph talking about all my like HTML mastery. Just 4 letters is enough to let someone know that you're familiar with the topic.
Roger, thank you. Hated Justin's girlfriend.
I am married to that beautiful woman. Thank you.
I'm sorry, hated your wife.
So I think we already heard it, but what is the first HTML element that we need?
HTML. Oh, you got it.
The header.
So it is the HTML element. This is the element that contains all of our other elements. So like we were saying before, if an HTML document is a tree, then this is like the root node of our tree that all the other nodes are connected to. So now inside of our HTML element, there are two mandatory elements that we must have. All HTML documents have the same structure with these first three elements, HTML, and there's two things inside of it. Can anyone tell me what those are supposed to be?
Head and body.
Head and body. So who wants to tell me what these two elements are for?
I think the head, you would put like any fonts or links to your style sheet, or like a title for your like tab, and then the body is actually like the content of the website.
Yeah.
You can also use, head for imports.
Yeah, so generally the head has information about the page, but nothing that actually renders on the screen. Whereas the body is the actual content. Everything in the body is what you see in the window. Cool, so now I'm going to make a simple HTML element in my body. So let's talk real quick just about some terminology, make sure we're on the same page here. So I know I've already used some of these words before, but what am I highlighting here? How would we call this?
A header.
Okay, so specifically, this is an H1, but just like more generically, we've got, some angle brackets and then some text in here, some text in here, more angle brackets. Really, like generally in HTML, what do we call something like this?
Tags.
So there are two tags here. So I guess let's
An element?
talk about that. Okay, yeah. So all this together, this is one element. The H1, the text here, the H1 here, this whole thing together is an element. Now, if I'm just looking at this guy in the front, angle bracket, H1 angle bracket, so what is that by itself? We heard it just like 10 seconds ago.
Tags.
Right. So this is an opening tag. And then we have this closing tag, which has this slash. So the whole thing here is an element, consists of an opening tag, closing tag, and content. Now, sometimes, actually, before I show you any more stuff, let's actually see how this looks. So I'm CD'd into the correct folder, got my index.html and some other files I'm not using. Creating an HTTP server using Python. So that says we're running on port 8000. Cool, cool. So let's go there. So this is my website. It says, welcome to the internet. That's great. Looks like it's working how I would expect. So I mentioned before, there are some tags that, or I was about to mention, there are some tags that do not need to be closed. So there are some tags in HTML that don't have content. And in that case, you can omit the closing tag because it's just assumed you closed it because there's no way to put content into it. So I think a simple example of that is the horizontal rule. Basically just makes a horizontal line on the page. So that's this guy here, the little gray line there is our horizontal rule. So this guy doesn't have content at all. It's just a line that fills the full width of its container. So I put the closing slash in the open tag. So this is basically an opening tag and a closing tag all at once. So we would call this a self-closing tag. So honestly, a lot of times you can just omit the n slash and it still works the same way. Technically, this is incorrect, but I think every browser will render this exactly the same way. So practically speaking, I don't always remember to put the closing tags in for self-closing elements. Okay, so in addition to the content, there is some more information that we can attach to an HTML element. Can anyone tell me, maybe you remember from the pre-work or whatever, or some other exploration you've done, what's another way that we can add some information to an HTML element? You might be getting some clues based on where I just put a space.
Passing attributes.
Yeah, so HTML elements can have attributes. So the way that looks is in the opening tag here, we can put any key value pairs that we want. So like one way you can think about this is that every HTML element is essentially like a dictionary. And that, in addition to having its content, you can just give it any other data that you want. So for example, we might give it ID equals so now I've given it one attribute. The attribute name is ID, and the attribute value is welcome message. And then I'll give it another attribute, give it a class. Class big text. So this is the general format for adding attributes to an HTML element. Key equals value, and then a space, and then more attributes if you want. It's important to remember that HTML attributes are always strings. So I could try like just putting a number in here, but it would still be interpreted as a string if I try to access it somewhere else. So you just have to remember that HTML attributes are always strings. And also many attributes are predefined. So when I add this ID in this class, the browser already knows what they mean. So I can just add my own attribute here, foo equals bar. And so this doesn't do anything. I've just added some information to this element. It just has this extra property on it, foo equals bar. I could check it later using like JavaScript or something. But if I don't try to read it and have any logic based on that, then it doesn't do anything. So let's see how we can see this information. So just looking at the H1 itself, not seeing anything interesting, it just looks the same. Welcome to the internet. But if I open up my inspector, which for reference, right click on the element, click inspect, that's going to open up our dev tools down here. Then in the elements tab, we can see all of our HTML elements, including the comments. And in the body, we can see our H1, it's got our ID, our class, and foo equals bar. So not super meaningful, but it's there. We've added some data to it. So let me just explain really quickly what IDs and classes are for. So soon we'll be using some CSS, and we're gonna have to apply styles to very specific elements. We're gonna use IDs and classes for basically labeling our elements so we can refer to them later. So they're similar, but there is a small difference. Can anyone tell me really quickly the difference between IDs and classes?
IDs apply to one and can only be a unique ID, and classes can apply to multiple elements, so you can apply the same styles to multiple things at a time.
Exactly. So IDs must be unique. There can only be one element on a page with a given ID. Whereas classes can be applied to many elements. So if you have some style that you want to, apply to many elements, like you have a lot of text boxes that should all be the same color, you could apply a class to them so they all get that same style. So that's really the only difference between them. Okay, so far I've just shown you one HTML element, the H1. This is a heading. This is like the top level heading. There are 6 of these H elements. So H2 is the second level heading. Now, the most obvious difference between them is that the H2 is smaller than the H1, but that's just a matter of their default stylings. That doesn't really matter, because when you start writing your own CSS, you can change these to be whatever size you want. Really, the difference between an H1 and an H2 is semantics. It's what they mean. An H2 means that this is a subheading, basically. And similarly, an H3 is a subheading. So it's like, in middle school, maybe you had to make outlines for your essays or whatever. And you would have like bulleted lists in your outlines with like indented topics for your subtopics. And then you would indent like your subtopics. And then you would indent like all of the like little points that you were trying to make in your subtopic or whatever. So it's kind of like that style of organization here. You're probably going to just have one H1 at the top of your page. And then like the major sections within it might have H2s at the top of them. And then if you have to have subsections inside of those, there's H3s. So there's probably no reason why you'll ever need an H6.
Challenge accepted.
So this does exist in HTML, but like the implication, if you're using an H6, is that you have like literally 6 levels of subheadings. And I have just never seen an HTML document that was that organized. Like if your document is that big, that it really warrants having 6 levels of organization. Like I don't want to read that on a web page. I'm just going to buy a book or something and like sit down on my couch with it or something. That's just way too long to be reading on the internet. So yeah, I've never seen a website that had such a need for organization that they use in H6, but it does exist. Yeah, so there's a whole bunch of other HTML elements as well. My favorite is probably the marquee tag, which you should never use professionally, but I really love it because it makes me happy. So this is one of the very few ways that you can make text move without CSS or JavaScript. This was like from the very early days of the web in the 90s, before people like used JavaScript really and still wanted to have moving text. So this is just kind of like a legacy feature of HTML. It is probably going to get removed at some point in the near future because nobody really likes it, but I just think it's funny. But there are actually a large number of very useful HTML elements. That's not it. What are we looking for here? Yeah. No, that was definitely not assessment 2. Don't worry about it. Ignore any assessments that you might have seen. You guys are going to get the assessment before you get the recording of this lecture, so I'm not concerned. Anyways, there are many HTML elements. I wouldn't be too overwhelmed though, because a lot of these are very niche. You're going to need them very rarely. It's the kind of thing that you'll Google, like, how do I do XYZ in HTML? And you'll find like, oh, this obscure HTML element that you've never heard of is perfect for that problem. And then you'll use it. Great. But there is a small number of HTML elements that you're going to use much more commonly. So let's see, this is showing some kind of like meta elements. This page is not organized in order of usefulness, which is a little bit unfortunate. So a lot of these early ones are not going to be particularly useful, but like title, that's maybe a fun one to start with. So a title element, this goes in the head. This is not like content in the main page, but this is information about the page. Oops. So can anyone see where the title is?
It's the tab name.
Yeah. So unfortunately, it's mostly cut off, just as my first HTML page, but you just get my F. So the unfortunate reality of being a web developer in 2022 is that no one's going to read your titles generally. Like, I mean, look at this, they're just all cut off. But they're still important for SEO. So that's search engine optimization. If you're just like, you know, Googling for web pages or whatever. I believe the title shows up here. Hang on. Yeah, so I think that the link that shows up here is the title of the web page. if I'm not mistaken. But either way, if you want your web page to show up in search engines, it should have a meaningful title and maybe even have some keywords that are like particularly relevant. And I know like some websites will actually use the title for like notifications. You know, like something like that. And then if you get a new notification, they just update the title to show you the current status of things. So that's kind of neat, I guess. There's some stuff you can do with the title. But technically, this is not part of the page itself. It's not part of the document. This is meta information about the page. So this goes in the head and not in the body. Yeah, a whole bunch of other elements. Now, again, there's a lot of things here. Don't get overwhelmed. Many of these are mostly the same. And in fact, some of these are exactly the same. So like the article element, the aside element, footer, header, I believe main, also nav, section, those are all exactly the same. They're just a box. It's just a generic box. Doesn't do anything else. The only difference between them is semantics. It's supposed to be more meaningful for, I guess, like developers who are reading your code, or maybe blind people who are using screen readers, that they need some software that's able to tell them, you know, what is the purpose and meaning of these different HTML elements to help, you know, guide their focus. So like an article tag, if you've got content that's like for an article, you could put that in there. Footer and header, if you've got content at the top or the bottom of your page, that might make sense. But really, the only difference is just the name of the tag and what people interpret them as meaning. These H tags are a little bit more different. You know, they have different default settings for font size, but other than that, they're mostly just boxes. Honestly, that's the truth for most HTML elements, is that they're just boxes. So as soon as you can think about HTML in that way, you're just putting boxes inside of boxes. I think you'll have an easier time, you know, laying out your pages and thinking about your HTML. Right, do we have any questions about anything we've talked about so far?
Is an HTML document a tree?
I would consider it such.
Yeah, it's sort of a non-question. I was just excited about trees.
Yeah,
Trees are great.
I have a general question. What's the deal with the foo bar? Like I see it used in everything, but I just don't understand why it's foo bar.
I really don't know, to tell you the truth. It's just the generic key value pair, just, or generic words that programmers use, is foo and bar. I want to say it came from the military originally.
FUBAR, effed up beyond all
Right.
recognition.
Yeah,
It's just developers being nerds.
it is possible. So we're not 100% sure. It's weird though, because when people say foobar as programmers, they don't mean something's messed up. They mean nothing at all. But
I just threw a link in the Zoom chat to something called the Jargon File, which shows like all the different kinds of like foo bars. Someone had asked me about that actually. So Terrence, someone else was wondering that as well. I thought it was from FUBAR as well. From looking in this, I'll just share it in the chat. There's some explanation that goes back to the 60s. My teacher in school used it, and that's why I use it. Like, I don't know, is that kind of how you came to it, Raphael?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
Yeah, I was just saying that like when I was taking CS courses, like my instructor would use like foo and bar all the time, and that's how I kind of picked up the habit.
I can't even say. I just feel like it's so ubiquitous. Like I'm sure, my early coding mentors in bootcamp would have used foo and bar, but I feel like every article that I read online is going to use it occasionally. Like comes up in like programming books, probably some XKCD comics use it. It's like if you're a programmer and you're involved in programmer culture, it's just something you're going to see a lot. I can't even remember where I would have seen it first.
Yeah, same. There's this website I love called the Jargon File that like talks about all those like weird aspects of programmer culture, most of which are from like the 60s and 70s. And there's one there that has this like long explanation about foobar being an acronym for some sort of thing with like an old mainframe, but who knows if that's like true or just like coincidence. But it like goes back to like all programmer culture basically goes back to like Stanford, MIT, or Berkeley in the 60s and 70s.
A lot of it, yeah.
Yeah, I shouldn't say all.
I mean, we're making new culture every day, but certainly a lot of references to the 60s still exist.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, and some of the old programmer culture is like it's like good riddance.
Yeah. All right. Were there any other questions before we continue onwards?
I have a quick question. The foobar example, like when you named your own attribute, are you able to like use that as a reference in your CSS? Or like why would you want to name your own attribute, I guess?
So I could potentially use this in my CSS. I could say like apply, make the text blue for any H1 who has bar for the value of foo. I probably wouldn't do that. More likely, I would just say anything with the class of, whatever gets the styling. Generally, we're going to style based on classes or IDs. It could be useful for JavaScript, though. So we'll see this, I think that's Wednesday of next week. We'll see how you can use JavaScript to access HTML elements. And when you do that, they'll basically look like dictionaries or objects. They're going to have properties, they're going to have methods on them. So in that way, we can just kind of store whatever data we want and access it later. Now, nowadays, people don't really do that so much. We don't like usually store our entire application state in HTML attributes. But what we'll find when we get to React is that React will still kind of use that metaphor, is that in React, we're going to basically be defining custom HTML attributes to pass our data through into custom HTML elements. So it's going to basically look exactly the same as this, using just made up HTML attributes on our elements.
Okay. And then I have one other question.
Yep.
If you wanted to like put an icon in the tab, is that done in title as well? You know how like a lot of websites have their own little like icon on the tab?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't have a great answer for you.
Okay.
It's possibly like some kind of Unicode thing. Like there might be just a regular character that you can type that renders as that icon. I don't know if there's a way you can get images into the title. I don't know. Oh wait, that's something else. Are you talking about like the icon just to the left of the title?
Yeah, exactly.
Oh, okay, that's something else. So that's called the favicon.
Favicon, like FAV icon.
Yeah.
favicon.
Get out of here.
But that would go on the title element as well.
No, that would be its own element. Can I just get a link tag for it? Okay, well, anyways, this is how you would use it.
Oh, yeah.
So yeah, link. I feel like you shouldn't need all 4 of these, but this is just like for cross-browser compatibility. Or for multiple different sizes, I guess. So depending on what size the browser wants to display your favicon, you've got multiple different options. There's like a big one, a small one. But yeah, just link, but instead of style sheet, it's an icon. And then that's how you set what goes up in the little corner here.
Yeah, and the link actually points to like an image file that you have to like have somewhere or be able to like point the browser to get.
Why is this a zip file? Whatever. I have exhausted my curiosity about favicons right now. I don't want to.
Yeah, I think it's got the image assets in there, Raphael, because I was seeing a bit of that, like it's saying like add these .png images to your, web server directory, and then add the links.
Yeah, I just want a link. We don't need to spend too much time just on favicons right now. But yeah, that's what it's called. Why don't I just add a comment here? All right, so I think one other thing I want to mention about HTML, this is really kind of touching on CSS a little bit, but there are different ways that HTML elements can display on a page. Kind of the simplest way is you can have block level elements. So if we look at like all these H elements, H1, H2, H3, they're all on their own line. I haven't like put line breaks between them. But because H1 elements are block level elements, they will automatically take up the full line. So that's different from inline elements. Like, so like strong makes content bolded. I guess you actually can't tell because the content is already bold. So let's try that here. So I put a strong tag just on this one word not, but it doesn't cause the word not to go to its own line. It fits in line with the rest of this tag because the strong element is an inline element.
So I imagine it would work the same if you stuck it in between professional and purposes.
Right.
Okay.
There are other display types between just inline and block level, but these are kind of the two major flavors, I guess. we'll dive more deeply into that on Monday. We'll get to the intermediate CSS. But speaking of CSS, there's really not much more I can say about HTML without talking about CSS. Most of the interesting aspects of HTML and the complexity in HTML is how it interacts with your CSS. So I think at this point, we're gonna take a quick break. And then when we come back, I'm gonna talk about CSS. Does anybody have any questions just about any of the basic stuff we've gone over today so far? Before we break? This all is just like super basic. Everybody knows this already. All right, great.
You have, sorry, one question. If you have multiple marquees, do they all line up in speed across the page, or will they be like staggered?
Great question. I actually did not know about the marquee element. That's awesome.
So yeah, they start at the same time, I guess. So they'll all be together. Really, this is like totally
Probably
not
depend on if you, however you set up their box element, I would imagine. Like if it, does it default to a block or does it default to inline? And I think that would do that.
Okay, so actually, let's take a look at some attributes here. This is going to be fun. So I've got an outer marquee element, and now you saw by default text scrolls from right to left. We'll take this out here for now. But we can add some attributes to it to change how it works. So we can have a direction attribute. So instead of going from right to left, it goes from top to bottom. And then we can set the behavior for it, which means what do we do when our element gets to the end of the screen? So by default, when it goes from the right to the left, it then wraps around to the right again, and then continues going back to the left. But maybe instead what we want is to have it alternate so it bounces back. When it gets all the way to the left side from the right, then it just switches direction, moves to the right. Apparently you can nest marquee tags. So this one is moving top to bottom. This one is moving right to left, but they're both alternating. So by nesting our marquee tags like that, sorry, my phone is. By nesting our marquee tags like this, we can like recreate those 90s screensavers where the text just like bounces around, which again, not for professional purposes. And as you saw, this feature is deprecated, is no longer recommended. Some browsers might still support it, but it's likely to be removed in the future. But until it is actually removed from browsers, I'm gonna continue using it for demos because I think it's funny. So that being said, let's, well, do we have any more questions for now? No more questions, okay. So it's a hair after 10. Let's take a break, come back at 10, and then we're gonna talk about CSS for a little bit. So now let us continue talking about CSS. So that's a complementary technology with HTML. It's going to help us style our document. So first of all, how do we actually, well, no, before we get there, let's see a few different ways that we can apply some styles to elements. So the most basic way that we can apply style to an element is with actually a style attribute on the element itself. So just like we have this foo equals bar, I can have style equals
I don't
you're not
think you're
sharing your
sharing your screen.
Oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. Okay. So just like I've got my attribute foo equals bar, I can create another style equals color red. Cool. And it's red. Amazing. So honestly, you're not going to do that too commonly. This is called an inline style. This is generally like your last resort when you're trying to style something. Another option is you can have a style tag in your HTML document. Excuse me. So in here, we can just name any HTML element that we want to style and then declare some rules for it. So now our H2 element is blue because of our style tag that we created. But again, you're not going to do this very often. This is not really the most common way of applying styles to your elements. What we would rather do is link in an external style sheet. See, I've already created this file here, main.css. I want to write all my styles in this file and then link them into this HTML file. Does anybody have any idea how I might do that?
Put your style tag and then like import it into that or something.
Okay, so I definitely need a style tag.
And then import
Well,
your
actually, no, I'm sorry,
CSS
I don't
file.
need a style tag. I misspoke. I'm sorry, you're trying to trick me here. I do not use a style tag in the head. Can someone tell me how do I actually do this?
Link, you need a link tag.
I need a link tag.
And then href attribute. And set that to your file path.
Nice. CSS. Cool. All right, so now in our main.css file, let's put some more styles. What do I want to do? So the third level heading has not been styled yet. So now in my main.css file, I can write any style rules that I want, and they will apply to all of the elements on the page that this file is linked into. So generally, the format for writing a CSS style is first we write a selector. This is saying what element or elements should this rule apply to. So here I'm just going to apply to an element H3, then some curly braces, and then everything inside of the curly braces are the rules that we want to apply. You can have multiple on each on their own line. So let's say I want to set font size 23 pixels. So I've got the style rule name, font size, and then a value, 23 pixels, and then a semicolon. You need the semicolon to end a style rule. And then I can put more things, font, family, fantasy, color. What's your favorite color? Someone say
Purple.
green, purple. And then if we refresh the page, we will see nothing, absolutely nothing. So I actually did not write my link tag correctly. So I told the browser what file that I'm linking, this main.css, but I didn't say why I'm linking it or what this file is, because there's a variety of different types of files that you can link into your document. So I need to specify the relationship between this file and my HTML document. The relationship is that this is styling my main document. It's a style sheet. So I need rel equals style sheet, and then the hyperlink reference. So this is some link, a hyperlink that refers to some other document that we can download. So now my styles are actually applying to this third level heading here. So that's great. If I want to inspect it, I can right click on it and then inspect. Here's my third level heading here. That's great. And then over on the right side here, we see the styles tab where it tells me the styles that are applied to this element. So here we can see everything that I've applied to it: font size, font family, and color. And we can see on the right here, where is this coming from? It's coming from main.css1. And then if I want, I can click through. So I just clicked on main.css1, and here it shows me the file that it thinks is applying those styles. So you're probably going to have problems at some point where you're going to write a style sheet and you think you know what your page should look like, and then you look at your page and it doesn't look that way. Well, maybe the style sheet that you thought was loaded is not actually being loaded. So you can click through here to check out, like, what does the browser actually think is being applied? So it's always good to just double check that what you wrote and what is actually loaded in the browser is the same thing.
Yeah, that's a really good point.
I had a
So,
quick question.
please.
So when you used font family fantasy, is that browser or like specific to the fonts that you have downloaded on your machine? Because I did the same thing that you've been doing, and my third level heading looks way different. Like it doesn't have the same font.
What browser are you using?
I'm using Brave browser. It's like a
Brave. Wow.
it's like a Chrome. It's like built off Chrome.
Yep. I tried Brave a while back. I haven't heard that in years though. So yeah, that's a good question. In this case particular, Fantasy is not actually a specific font, but it refers to like a system default. So kind of another example is like serif. So does everyone know what serif versus sans serif means? Or does anyone know that? I guess we'll start there.
It has a little curly cues or the decorations at the ends of the letters.
Yeah. So actually, we'll set this one to sans serif. Okay. That's not. So we zoom way in on the text here. The H1 up here, this is a serif font. And so you see it's got like the little feet on the ends of the letters, little curly bits. Then this here is a sans serif font. It does not have the serifs. So the bottoms of the letters are just like more straight and blocky. So those are kind of like two different types of fonts. It's not a specific font. It's just a general type of font. There's like two types of fonts, serif and sans serif. And so if you want to, you don't even have to specify a specific font. You can just say sans serif, and then your browser will use its default sans serif font. Different browsers will have different defaults, but it'll be some sans serif font. So similarly, browsers have a built-in default fantasy font, which is just something that looks like wild and crazy, I guess. I think in Chrome, this is supposed to be Papyrus.
Yeah.
The avatar fonts.
Yeah. It doesn't tell me what it's actually using in this browser. Just still tells me fantasy.
At the bottom, it said rendered font at the very bottom.
Yeah, rendered font, Papyrus, cool. But yeah, so Brave might be using a different default for fantasy, but either way, you should probably not be using this in like real websites. I definitely used it a bunch when I was in a boot camp, and my instructor made fun of me for it. So I don't know. Let's see. Let's set some more interesting properties. Well, I want to set some properties on this H2 here. So there's the H2 here. So I've added a class to it. This is going to be my big heading. Even though it's the H2 under the H1, I'm going to make it bigger than the H1, even though that's a little unconventional. So now I'm going to target my H2 in a different way. I'm not going to just say H2 because that would apply to all the H2 elements on my page. And maybe I have many H2 elements and I only want this style to be applied to some of them. So instead, I'm going to target this by its class. I call that big heading. So the way that we target a class in CSS is by using a period, and then we say the name of the class. So now my second level heading is much larger. Let's put some more style on it though. Yeah. All right, so now things should look a little bit different. We've applied a bunch of styles to it. And it's also kind of in a different place. It looks like it's kind of pushed out a little bit to the side, pushed away from its neighbors here. So that's because of these different styles that I applied to it. And also because of something called the box model. So I'm going to inspect this element here a little bit more closely, right click on it, inspect, takes me over here. And so now over here, so over here at the bottom of the styles tab, this is what's known as the box model. So this is a very important thing to understand about HTML. This is something that applies to every HTML element. It's a very fundamental thing to understand in terms of just where it appears on the screen and how it interacts with things around it. So I told you earlier in this lecture that every HTML element is a box. So that's true, but is a bit of a simplification. Every HTML element is actually several boxes inside of each other. So if we look at this set of nested boxes here, that should make it more clear. So the innermost box, this is your content. And we can see here it's 500 pixels by 100 pixels because that's what I set it to. Yeah, height 100 pixels, width 500 pixels. But it's got some other boxes. So outside of the content and before the border, there is padding. So padding is what creates space between the content and the border. Outside of the border, outside of the padding, we have this other box for the border, which behaves roughly how you would expect it to. It's a line that goes around your element outside of the padding. It's a border. And then outside of the border, there's yet another box for the margin. And so this specifies the space between this element and other elements. So if I look at this H3 here, I'm hovered over it and you can see the boxes for it on the page. You can see its margin bumps up right against the H2. And our H2 actually has a smaller margin, but that's okay. It doesn't really matter. So the lower margin on our H2 isn't really doing anything because the upper margin on our H3 is what is actually enforcing the space here. So margins don't actually push against each other, but they do push against the border. See how that works here? Okay, so now there are yet other ways that we can refer to elements. So I've just got a class on my H2, but we can also give it an ID. So if I apply color red in my big heading, makes the text red. That's what you might expect. But I created an ID here. How can I style this element based on the ID? Does anyone know what syntax I need for that? I use the period to target a class. What do I use to target an ID?
The hash symbol.
Hash. Call this hash name of the class, or name of the ID, I'm sorry, hash green text. Make that green. Okay, but now we have two different style rules applying different styles to the same element. Because our one H2 is big heading and it's also green text. So how do we know if it's going to be green or red? Who has a hunch? How can we know?
The ID would trump the class.
Yeah. So the ID takes precedence. We say that the ID is more specific than the class. So it will override it. So this is an important topic in the CSS, is specificity. It's just knowing when multiple conflicting styles are applied to the same element. It's knowing which one will actually apply ultimately. So there are some rules for CSS specificity. Try to explain these in as simple of a way as I can. Actually, let's show you one other demo before I just start explaining things. So I'm going to add another class. And the way you add multiple classes is separated by spaces. you cannot have a second attribute with the same name. Just like in a dictionary, you can't have two keys that are the same. So if the element has multiple classes, we just separate them by spaces. This also means that a class name cannot have a space in it because HTML will interpret that space as just being multiple classes. So let's actually take that out for now. Okay, so in this case, both these elements or both these style rules here are applying color to the same element, but we're referring to it in different ways. Here, we're just referring to this element by one class dot another class, which that should be valid. It has another class on it. And here, we're referring to it by two classes. We're saying this should target elements that have both of these classes, big heading and another class. So to be clear, this refers to one element with two classes. So this might seem like it's redundant because, you know, just saying big heading already refers to the element we want. Why are we using two classes here? But this makes it more specific. So because there are two classes, that overrides styles that only have one class in them. So yeah, blue is applied with only one class. Red is applied with these two classes. So the red color is going to take priority over that. So the general rules of CSS specificity is a selector with an ID override a selector with any number of classes. A selector with a class override a selector with any number of elements. So for example, like this selector just dot another class is more specific than this selector just H3. Selecting something by class is more specific than selecting something just by an element. But whenever you have a tie, you can like go to the next smallest thing. So for example, if you have one selector that's just an ID and another selector that's an ID and a class, the selector that is an ID and a class will override the one that's just an ID because they're tied on the number of IDs they have. So you can use the class as a tiebreaker. Similarly, if we have multiple selectors that are just one class, so let's say we add another class to our H3. So now another class is applying blue color, H3 is applying purple. So we can see our H3 is now blue because the class selector is more specific. But if I update this selector, instead of just H3 to say H3 dot another class, now what I'm saying is that this style should apply to not just any H3, but specifically any H3 element that has this class, another class. And so that makes this more specific. So both of these selectors have one class in them, and it's actually the exact same class. So we need a tiebreaker. So we're going to look at the next smallest thing, and that's the element. So because this one has a class and an element in the selector, and this one is just a class, this top one is going to be more specific. So the purple color should take precedence here. Yeah, cool. And then one other little bit about writing selectors is that sometimes we want to style elements inside of other elements. So let's say I want to apply some special styling to every strong tag inside of a marquee. So not every strong tag, but just the ones that appear inside of marquee elements. Can anyone tell me what syntax I use to do that? Targeting a strong element inside of a marquee.
So first you would target marquee by writing marquee, and then right after that, I think it would be a period. It's either a period or a comma, and then it would be strong, and then after that would just be as if it was a regular in brackets.
So we already saw the period. So the period is for classes. So if I said marquee.strong, this would style a marquee element that has a class called strong, but we haven't defined a class called strong. We've created an element called strong, so that's not quite what we want. You also said marquee comma strong. Is that right?
There's also an answer in the chat as well.
My favorite CSS color, get some burly wood in there. So let's see, marquee comma strong, what does that do? So not exactly what we wanted. So what that did was apply our style to all strong tags and all marquee elements. So when you use a comma, you're actually just writing two selectors. So this here, marquee comma strong here, this is just a shorthand for this, basically. If you're going to apply the exact same style rules, so the same set of style rules to two different selectors, you can separate them with a comma to apply to both of them. But that's not what we're trying to do here. So what do I do if I want to get my set of style rules here to only apply to strong elements inside of marquee elements? What is the syntax for that?
So Alicia suggested marquee, the greater than sign, and then strong.
That is correct, but it's not the answer I wanted. But let's see that real quick. Okay, that was the answer I wanted. So first, let's just go with Alicia's original answer. If you want to style an element inside of another element, one way to do that is with this caret. So this means a strong inside of a marquee. So that does do what I wanted. So the not gets the color, nothing else in the marquee does. But more specifically, what this does is this styles direct children. So this will not style a grandchild or a great-grandchild of the marquee element. This will only style a direct child. So if we change it, so our marquee had first an M tag. It's for emphasis. So by default, this makes text look italicized. Yeah, so now we can see that the text is italic, but it's no longer colored because the strong tag is no longer a direct child of the marquee. It's now a grandchild of the marquee. So writing your styles like this with the direct child selector is a little bit more brittle, I would say. It makes it more likely that if you make small changes to your HTML that your styles are going to break. So I don't use this quite as commonly unless you know this is specifically what you need. More commonly, I'm just going to use the space. So space is the kind of descendant selector. This means apply these styles to a strong element that is anywhere inside of a marquee element. Could be a child, could be a grandchild, great-grandchild, doesn't matter. Strong element anywhere inside of a marquee element is going to get these styles. Incredible. So it is now still italic. Really hard to click on that when it's moving. Still italic, but we also got the color styles applied to it. What questions have we got so far?
Can you scroll down to the bottom where you made the text bounce? The bottom of your code?
It's just this all here. This is not something that we're expecting you to remember and repeat, by the way. I'm just trying to make HTML as exciting as it possibly can be, which is not fair. I guess I shouldn't say that. There are some HTML elements that are a little more exciting, but we'll get to that later. Michael, what's up?
Okay, so kind of going back to my question before about the fantasy and using the default font for that family per browser, is there a way to make it so that everybody sees the same exact font? So that way, like, you don't leave whatever that display as up to the interpretation of everybody else's individual computers, but it's like one thing for everybody.
I mean, so you can download a font in like a link tag or whatever. So you can like download a specific font and that will guarantee that it looks exactly the same on everyone's machine. I honestly don't like doing that so much because it like takes time to load the font. And so sometimes users will see like the content shift as it first loads with the default font and then your custom font loads and then all the text gets updated to the new font, which is like kind of jarring. But also like different fonts look different in like different browsers or different monitors. So you still can't actually guarantee that it's going to look exactly the way you want it on everyone's screen. So honestly, I don't think it's so bad to just use default fonts or like have a font stack is what they call it. So you can say like, oh, is it Arial? Yeah. So they call this like a font stack. You can name multiple fonts and the browser will use Arial if it has Arial. If not, it'll use Helvetica. And if it doesn't have either of those, it'll just use its default sans serif font. So you're gonna basically let the browser use its more like natural fonts that maybe it renders better, that looks good in that browser. Where if you're just giving it your own custom font, like, I don't know, there might be unexpected headaches with that. I don't know, like custom fonts aren't uncommon. People definitely use them, especially for like really like well-designed and like pretty kinds of websites. But I feel like they can be kind of a lot of hassle in ways that you might not expect. And the default built-in fonts, I think, are good enough. And there's ways to make them work.
Okay, thank you.
Do we have some other questions? All right, so I don't want to get too much deeper into like the specifics of CSS and like different rules and stuff. There's a lot of them. Let's actually just take a look real quick. So again, don't get overwhelmed because there are a lot of CSS properties and you're going to use most of them never. There's a small handful of CSS properties that are very important to understand that you'll use every time you write CSS, and I'll talk about those on Monday. There are some that you'll use just occasionally when a problem arises and you'll Google like, how do I do this thing? And Stack Overflow tells you like, oh, use the animation direction property or whatever. And then most of these you'll never use. I have never seen most of these in my career. But some of these, like, border, very useful. Background we saw earlier. Color is useful. But yeah, definitely the vast majority of these you'll never need to use. And many of these are also redundant. So like I showed you the margin property and I just said like 10 pixels. So that puts 10 pixel margin on each side. But if you want to be more specific, there's also margin bottom, margin left, margin right, and margin top. And same for border. You can have different width borders on different sides, which looks kind of funny, but you can do it. Yeah, a lot of stuff.
Yeah, I just want to, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No, go on.
I was just going to concur about not using all these CSS properties. And also just add that using the Chrome developer tools that you saw Raphael using is really powerful for CSS because it visualizes things like the box model and also lets you like edit the CSS where rules. So it's a really good way to experiment with stuff. And I think that that's usually like if I have to work with CSS, that's how I'll tweak stuff to get it to what I want. Raphael, I also wanted to ask if you ever look at the Can I Use site. I know at one point that was
that's great.
that I was looking at all the time.
So as you get into front end stuff, this becomes important because like we were saying, different browsers have different defaults for one thing, but also just different features they support. Some browsers just can't do things that other browsers can do. So if you're wondering like, hey, can I use like Flexbox? You can just go to caniuse.com and it'll tell you which browsers support this and as of when. So, nowadays Flexbox is very well supported. If I have some customers that are using Opera Mobile and they haven't updated past version 12, then my Flexbox website is not going to work on their device. But almost nobody's using Opera Mobile, and Opera Mobile doesn't really support any useful features anyway, so I don't care about catering to them. IE is also something you're going to see that doesn't support many features, but we also don't really care about that anymore. I feel like in the past few years, we have crossed a threshold where we no longer have to care about like building websites that are compatible with Internet Explorer.
Yeah, for a long time, I think like public institutions and governments, the government had to care about old versions of Internet Explorer. I'm not even sure if that's the case anymore. It might be though, especially for government things.
There are literally government applications that you have to use Internet Explorer to look at.
That is true, but I think the question is, does it support Internet Explorer version 6? I didn't phrase it very well. And that's more about like making sure that something is accessible by the widest possible audience. But like Raphael was saying, in the past couple of years, there has been a big shift. Like, so I'm not even sure if like supporting Internet Explorer 6 is important anymore. I don't know if it's on Can I Use. Somewhere you can definitely look up and see like what percent of internet users are using what browser and version and stuff. And that's kind of the challenge with the web too, is just you're targeting like multiple platforms, like between mobile devices and desktops and browser differences. It's really kind of interesting.
I mean, allegedly, 21% of the globe is using Chrome between versions 80 and 101. So they give you some kind of statistics here. It's not compiled in a particularly useful way, though.
Interesting. Does it say how many people are still using Internet Explorer 6 through 10?
More than Opera Mobile, apparently.
Like 6% or
We got some
something.
diehard users. Yeah, it's some like hospital or bank they just can't update,
Yeah.
or some government office or whatever. But yeah, definitely if you care about cross-browser compatibility, which if you're a front-end developer, you do care about that, you're going to probably find yourself on Can I Use fairly often. So you'll just need to make sure that whatever features you want to use, they're accessible to all of the users you care about, all the browsers you care about. And if not, you might have to find some way to re-implement that feature or just decide you don't need it.
So the author, Tim Ferriss, talks about avoid spending 80% of your time on 20% of your customers.
Yeah,
That's totally true if you're a for-profit business. And I think that's why you see a lot of commercial websites don't care about supporting all the versions of Internet Explorer. Again, like if you're like a bank is a great example, like an institution like a bank clearly has to support or should, or like a public library or like the IRS website. Yeah, sorry, I didn't mean to be flip, and that's totally true. Like especially at startups, you'll see that that's the case. I worked somewhere where the CTO was dead set on supporting Windows Phone. This was in like 2008.
I'm so sorry.
And we hadn't even launched a project, and it was just the worst idea ever. And that startup totally ran out of money and never launched a product. In part because of the hours upon hours spent trying to support Windows Phone, which had even then like a minuscule amount of users.
So let's talk about debugging a little bit. So you'll hear a lot of people say that CSS is hard or it makes no sense. They don't like it. What they really mean is I have no clue how to debug CSS and I've never cared to learn. If you actually know how to use dev tools, I swear CSS is not that bad. So I'm going to try to give you a few of my tips about debugging CSS and making it work.
And I think for me, at least, Raphael, like working professionally, doing any sort of front-end work, Chrome and Chrome developer tools is just the sort of the standard these days. That's been my experience.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so I definitely encourage everyone, like it's not a question of what browser you enjoy using, but for developing and doing work when you're doing stuff with HTML and CSS, use Chrome because the developer tools are just the industry standard.
Okay, so let's apply some styles to our welcome message. It's going to be orange. Now let's look at our welcome message, and it is not orange. Nothing has happened. So why do we think nothing has happened? A lot of potential reasons why this is not working. So the first thing that I want to check is my CSS file even being downloaded at all? So what I'm going to do is go to the network tab first. And this is going to show me all the files that had to get downloaded in order to run this page. So first it's showing you the main document. That's not super exciting right now. More interesting though, is this other thing. Looks like someone failed to write main.css or something. Tells me 404 file not found. So we're trying to download something, didn't work. I'm thinking that this doesn't look like the right name for my main.css. So I'm going to check out my HTML, see if I'm linking that incorrectly. And sure enough, I am not. So step one, check the network tab, make sure that your style sheet is actually being downloaded. Okay, so now the style sheet is being downloaded, but the text is still red. So I'm just like kind of losing my mind because it says the style sheet is being downloaded. It looks like it's the right style sheet here. My main CSS, it says that welcome message should be orange. This is my welcome message. Right. Oh, that's right. I had the inline style on it. So talking about specificity, an inline style is going to override anything else in your other style sheets. So can't do anything interesting there. Okay, so taking that out, now we can actually see the orange text. So just a second. Okay. So I had to tweak this. Wait, what? Maybe I'm just bad at typing. Okay, so for some reason, I'm actually not able to trigger the error that I want to demonstrate. My browser is accidentally doing what I want it to instead of misbehaving, so I can show you how to fix problems. But what I wanted to show you is that a problem which many of you are likely to encounter while you're starting out developing HTML and CSS is that your browser will cache your CSS file. So I'm developing this file, main.css, my browser loads it, great. Then I make changes to the CSS file, and then I try to load that new version of my CSS file, and the browser is going to say, wait a second, you're trying to load a file called main.css on localhost 8000. Well, I've already downloaded a file called main.css on localhost 8000. So I'm not going to like re-download the same file again, just going to use the copy I already have. Of course, your browser doesn't realize that you're actively developing the main.css, and it's going to be a different version every time as it loads. So that's really frustrating.
Yeah, this is super actually important. I've spent so much time getting stuck on this.
Yeah, and like every cohort, students get stuck on this. So the solution is check this little gear here in your dev tools. Got a bunch of options. Under network, you want to disable cache while DevTools is open. If you do not have this checked, you are setting yourself up for a lot of frustration as a front-end developer.
Can you show us how you got there again?
So right-click, inspect, opens up this whole menu down here. A little gear at the top right opens up this weird little settings menu. Under network is disable cache while DevTools is open. So we go to DevTools, top right gear menu, to network section, disable cache while DevTools is open. Very important that you had that checked.
I actually didn't know about that. That's cool. I think I just got so used to doing like hard refreshes.
Yeah, I mean, you can also do that.
This is way better. This is cool. This is
So
way
you
better.
can view and then force reload the page. So that means like refresh the page without using the cache. But if you don't want to remember that keyboard shortcut, then you can just set the setting in your DevTools. So it'll do a hard reload every time you reload while DevTools is open. Okay, so that's definitely going to happen to you sometimes.
There was a question about finding the source of a CSS rule. And maybe someone, if Luis, I think that was you, maybe if you just want to ask it. Or it was basically about if you can, in DevTools, you should be able to see where a CSS rule is coming from, right? Like if you were to see if it was a style written inline in the HTML file versus in the .css file.
Yeah, so over here on the DevTools on the right, I'm checking out my welcome message. It is green. If I want to know why it's green, it tells me on the right here, this is coming from main.css line 7. And I can click through. And this is another important debugging technique. If your styles are not being applied the way you think they should be, look at what your browser thinks your style sheet looks like. Look at what your editor thinks your style sheet looks like, and maybe make sure that they're the same and that your browser is actually loading the style sheet you think it is. Because oftentimes it's not. That's been a common source of errors for me. So let's see, there are some other reasons though why your styles might not be applied the way you think they should be. So let's add another ID here. I think it just doesn't like that I put 2 IDs on it. So we're actually going to do a slightly different demo. So yeah, let's look at our H3. And it's got another class. We're going to give it also some class. So we've got some class and another class. And then in our H3, so now my H3 is red. Let's say I want to know why it's red. I'm going to inspect it. And so I can see here that it's got 2 different color styles being applied to it. Color red is coming from main.css line 24, and color blue is coming from main.css line 21. Again, I can click through and it shows me where that is in my style sheet. It's potentially useful. So what I want to point out though, is that this blue color from another class has this strike through on it, which means that it's being overridden. There is another cascading style, which is taking priority over this. So this is saying that the color blue would be applied to this element, if not for the fact that some other color is being applied that overrides that. And so in fact, if I just temporarily uncheck this color red, and then the blue color applies because the one thing that was overriding it is no longer applied. Put that back on. And just for reference, in this case, the reason why the red color is being applied is just because it appears after the color blue. Since both of these selectors have the same specificity, it's just one class, then the one that comes after will take priority.
I know I don't have like a lot of CSS experience or whatever, but one of the things that I always struggled with when I was trying to learn it was like which styling properties need to be applied to which type of like element or selector. Like, for example, I would be trying to edit some, links in like my nav bar, for example, and I would try to apply nav bar text color blue, and it wouldn't change like the color of the links, right? So I'd have to actually apply it directly to the link. And that was one of the hardest things for me, has been one of the hardest things. I haven't used much of it, but it's like, okay, which can I apply to an overall container and which has to go down? Like how far in do I have to go to apply this specific style?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that's an interesting question. So for one thing, most styles can be applied to most elements. Link tags, the A tag, I should say, actually anchors for, making links that you can click on other pages. Anchor tags are kind of special. Some generic CSS properties don't apply to them, like coloring links is a little bit awkward. And there are some special properties you can apply to links to control how they get colored. Part of it has to do with the fact that links can have different states they can be in. Like, by default, a link is blue, but then after you click on it, it like turns purple to indicate that you've already visited that link. So those are different states that the link can be in. And so you have to style those states specifically, or else the color won't apply. So we'll talk about that a little bit on Monday. And generally speaking, though, if you apply a style to a parent element, like okay, so generally styles are not inherited. If you apply a style to a parent, it does not apply to the children. The exceptions are for CSS properties that are related to fonts. So font size, font family, and color. If you apply that style to a parent, you should expect that the children will get it as well. So like our marquee here, I could apply a color to the marquee element, and I would expect that the M and strong tags would also get that color because they're inside of the marquee. It wouldn't make sense if I had to color those individually. Like I just want to set the color once on the container. But for things like height and width, I wouldn't want that to be inherited. Like a child element shouldn't have the same height as its parent just because it's a child. Like the child should be smaller. So most properties are not inherited from parent to children, but properties that relate to fonts, like font size, font family, and color, those do get inherited. And links and anchor tags are just weird in general. Does that help?
Yeah.
Cool. Yeah, so watch out for this strike through. So you know that you did successfully apply a style. It's just that something else is more specific. So you need to, look in your style sheet and change the specificity around. Maybe I need to just add something else to make this more specific, just like marquee dot another class. So now it's going to be or wait, this is H3, right? So yeah, now it's blue instead of red because I've made this selector a little bit more specific. So now the red class has the strike through because that is the least specific thing here. Another problem that you might encounter is if you have an invalid style name, style rule name, you'll get this little yellow triangle. So that means something very specific. You basically made up a CSS style that the browser doesn't recognize. So if I see this, I'm like, I just trying to set the color on this. Isn't that not valid? I'm going to Google, you know, CSS color, like, isn't that it? And then I see in the documentation, like, oh, it's spelled with an O and not an OU. So I just misspelled the style rule. So I can fix that typo there. And I no longer get the yellow triangle. Similarly, I just make up a value. Same kind of story. We get that yellow triangle telling me that I made up something here. It doesn't recognize it, doesn't know how to apply this. Let's see, let's get a little trickier here. Get rid of this guy here. So for my sum class is applied to the H3 and it's making it red. So we got a red H3, right? What happens if I just forget the semicolon? So that's like an essential part of CSS syntax. Each of these style rules need to have a semicolon at the end. I'm going to refresh the page now. And okay, that actually didn't work how I wanted to. Okay, so this is what I want to show you. I have forgotten the trailing brace here. So how does that break my code? What is wrong?
Everything after it.
So this is one of the kind of unfortunate parts about CSS. Having a problem with this sum class doesn't break this style rule, it just breaks everything under it. So I guess the syntax highlighting kind of clues you into that. Similarly, oh, I thought that would still apply the color. I swear I've done this demo in the past where omitting the semicolon would cause this rule to apply correctly and then things below it would break, which just made it hard to debug. There might have been a change to how browsers read your CSS, so it seems like that's not an issue anymore.
It looked like it like put it all in one line. I considered it the same. And because it had color red and then font size 99px on the web page all in one line as opposed to, yeah.
Oh, it does.
Did you want to get rid of the colon or the semicolon?
The semicolon. I was expecting that the color would still apply, but not the font size. So I think there might be some difference in how the browsers handle invalid CSS compared with when I've done this demo in the past.
Yeah, they're like small stuff like that is always kind of updating. Yeah.
That's the fun part of being a front-end developer is that these little things change all the time. I was actually once giving a tech demo about some like music project that I had built. And then like the night before I was going to give the demo, there was a major update to Chrome and it like completely broke my demo and I had to refactor it late at night in order to like actually give the demo. So that was stressful, but it's just the life of being a front-end developer. Danielle?
Would it apply if you put it under the font? Like after the font size?
Could you say that again, please?
If you change like Right, that without the semicolon.
Thank you.
So it is big, it is red. Wait, why is it red? Is something else making it red? But this is, you know, the thought process of the CSS developers. Why is this red? So I've inspected it. By the way, this little guy over here also lets you inspect elements. So I click on it and you can hover over anything and it shows you the box model. I click on this, it selects the element in the Elements tab. So yeah, it's red from some class. Oh, we still have the Burleywood color over there. So it seems
Looks
like
Chrome is automatically putting the semicolon in.
I think so. It used to not do that, I swear. But you should still strive to write syntactically correct CSS, even if your browser is able to understand you in certain circumstances. In just a second. Okay, yeah, and then one last little debugging thing that I wanted to show you. Situations where the rule does apply, but the value is not correct. So like, you know, this text here is way too big. So one thing you can do is just click on it in your inspector here and just type in a different value. So maybe 46 pixels is better, or 32 pixels. So you can just interactively try it out like that. My favorite is if you click on it and then scroll, you can like gradually increase it pixel by pixel, either up or down, or at least up. It won't scroll down for some reason. I'm not sure what the problem is. There we go. So that's super handy. You can also do this for colors, which is super fun. So CSS does support color names. I don't really use those outside of demos. More commonly, you're going to be choosing colors by their RGB values. So I'm going to say RGB and then parentheses, 3 numbers for red, and then green, and then blue. So I guess, and it's from 0 to 255. 0 is none of that color, and 255 is as much as possible of that color. So it's very red and a little bit of green, not a lot of blue. And if I want to kind of like interactively futz around with these colors, make it, you know, a little bit less red or whatever, I can just click here, hover, and then yeah. So here I'm just like slowly decreasing the green, increasing the green.
Is there a hotkey to be able to step up instead of like one digit, 10 digits or something?
There actually might be, but I don't know what it is. And I'm actually not sure. Okay, so I'm adding some blue. It's getting kind of pink. Turn down the red a little bit. It's getting more like kind of a grayish purple or something. I don't know. But yeah, point is you don't have to keep flipping back and forth between your HTML and your CSS and changing things one at a time. But the dev tools provide like interactive ways that you can change things.
That's not going to change your actual file, right? You'll still have to go back and change your file.
Right. It's all just temporary here. As soon as I refresh the page, it goes back to how it was. And also element.style, you can add inline styles to any element. So like if I want, I can change what's in a specific CSS file or like add style rules to a specific CSS selector. So like, so here I've just added a style to this selector, so it still has to, follow the rules of specificity. But if I just absolutely want to apply some style to something just to see how it looks, I can apply an inline style by doing element.style, and we can say something like that. So because this is an inline style, it's going to override the one that I put just in this selector for the, because this is just has one class, .some class, element.style is an inline style. Yeah, you can see here on the element itself, style equals border, 5 pixels offset grain. So that's going to override anything. And you should probably almost never need to use this. In general, you should try to keep your specificity as low as possible in your style sheet so that it's easier for other developers to override your styles. Someone just had their hand up.
Yeah, so if you're updating the class in the dev tools, that inspect element, like, is that gonna, would that update your main.css file?
No, it's just for exploration to see what it would look like.
Okay.
Because it can be pretty slow to debug by just making changes in your CSS file and then reloading the page. Especially if you have to navigate through the app and submit a form in order to see the thing you're trying to debug. You're not going to want to go through that process every time just to see how does it look with a different color or with 2 pixels extra padding. You can just go to the part of the page where your element appears and then fiddle with it interactively. And then once you decide yeah, this looks good, you can maybe copy the styles into your style sheet.
Yeah, there is a way with Chrome DevTools, the way it lets you view files, you can connect it to your actual source code. So not in the editor tab, but in the one on the left, if you were looking at a CSS file under the sources tab. But honestly, it gets really confusing. And I tried a couple times to set it up and I never got it to work really well. So I wouldn't recommend it, especially when starting out, because it can be really confusing. And I don't think people use it professionally regularly because it can interact with other tools and get annoying. But just as a fun fact, and that's kind of why Chrome DevTools I think is so amazing too. It has all this crazy stuff, and you have the color picker, you have the performance tab, the memory tab. It's pretty great. And then there are the extensions that you'll see when we get to React.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. All right. So on that note, I think that's about all I've really got to say about CSS. Just want to make sure that we had all the basics down. We're starting on common ground with the same terminology, just classes and IDs, just how to write the basic selectors, and just want to make sure you have your basic debugging tools so you don't get super frustrated when you're starting your CSS exercises. You should be able to follow the thought process of, this thing isn't the color I want it to be. Why is it that color? And then just inspect it. Look at what styles it does have. Look at where those styles are coming from and think about why the style that you want to apply is not overriding the styles that are actually being applied. I swear this is a logical step-by-step process you can take to debug CSS. A lot of people act like CSS just makes no sense, and they'll just guess solutions one after another until something works. And that's just no way to be a developer.
That's a really good point. Yeah, I've definitely done that, but CSS does make sense, and it definitely pays off kind of learning the rules and the tools and the process that you walk through for debugging.
Yeah. All right, so I think at this point we're going to open it up for questions. And then maybe see if we can squeeze the retro into the rest of the morning afterwards. But yeah, so what questions have we got?
Got a question. If you're doing a web page and you see something that's really cool or really annoying, and you want to see, you'd like to know like how they did that, can you go into the dev tools and like be able to inspect that specific thing? For example, on like I think it's the Geeks for Geeks web pages, like after like 3 or 4 seconds, they pop up an annoying like thing to join. Can you see how to do that?
I know what you're talking about. I'm waiting. It's going to come here any second. Really, is this the only time you're going to let me use your website without getting harassed? Okay, I know what you're talking about. I don't know why it's not showing up. It's like it knows we're listening and doesn't want to give us the pop-up. So I know Medium does similar things. If you read too many Medium articles, you get like the pop-up. Yeah.
CNN always has annoying things.
CNN is such a terrible website. Just like from a technological perspective, this makes me want to cry. So I don't know, let's inspect here. Say I don't like this ad at the top. Oh gosh. So I'm just going to add an inline style, display none. Take off display block. Okay, so there might be a little bit too much going on CNN's website for me to do this very quickly, because there's probably a lot of other styles being applied simultaneously. I think, why is it so hard to find a website with a pop-up? But anyways, the short answer to your question is yes, you can like right-click the page and then remove elements that you don't want to see, or change them in other ways, or just see how they're made.
So I've done that before to get rid of stuff, but sometimes it blocks, like it doesn't let you scroll anymore after you do that. So how do you do it to prevent them preventing you to scroll? Because like there's like newspaper websites that will like say like, oh, to continue reading, you gotta, join or pay. And then I just get rid of that, and then it won't let me do anything else.
So they're probably, this is something we'll talk about later, but they're probably using event handlers to prevent you from scrolling. So you can see like event listeners that are on the page, like watching for you to, whatchamacallit, like type some input or click on an element. So these are all like the click handlers that are on Geeks for Geeks. You can just like click on all these different things, and this is code that it'll run, I guess. These are elements that have click events on them. But so you can also handle the scroll event. And so apparently this website does a whole bunch of stuff when you scroll already. And so maybe part of that is like optionally being able to disable scrolling when the pop-up comes up, So there are ways that websites can like notice when you try to scroll and then prevent you from actually doing that, which is super frustrating, but it's technologically possible. So there's definitely a way that you can undo that, but it would take a little bit of digging. Maybe something more practical is I know all of you guys are really big on dark mode here, but unfortunately a lot of websites don't support that. So let's see here. I'm going to add just an inline style to the body. set it to filter invert 1. And so now everything is just like the opposite color. Black is white and red is anti-red. I don't know, I'm not an expert on color theory, but this is like a very quick way to, you know, get a readable color scheme if you're reading something at night that's made for day mode. I think it's kind of cool. Anyways, what other questions have we got? No more questions. All right, so I think that's about enough HTML CSS for today. So thank you everybody for coming, listening, asking questions, everybody. I love it.